Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Bianca Collins. I'm the curator of public programs for the Fowler Museum at UCLA. Fowler's doors reopened to the public on July 1, and we are thrilled to be welcoming visitors back to the galleries. But for now, we are continuing to offer our programs virtually. So thank you for joining us today or tonight, depending on where it is you're tuning in from around the world. Currently on view, the Map in the Territory, 100 Years of Collecting at UCLA, distills the vast holdings of UCLA's diverse collections into a single exhibition. Today, we are proud to be joined by Helen Rees, Director of the World Music Center at UCLA, and welcoming Tyler Yamin, a PhD candidate in the Department of Ethnomusicology at the UCLA Herb Alpert School of Music. Tyler will discuss a notable rebab included in the Map in the Territory from the Department of Ethnomusicology's World Instrument Collection, the first to be included in a university ensemble in the United States. We'll learn about the use of the rebab in traditional Javanese music and culture, and about the role of this particular instrument in establishing world music performance ensembles across the globe. Helen Rees is a professor in the UCLA Department of Ethnomusicology and director of the department's World Music Center. For 30 years, she has conducted ethnographic and archival research on Chinese music, publishing widely in Chinese and English, and has collaborated on numerous ethnographic CDs of music from the multi-ethnic southwest of China. With UCLA professor Aparna Sharma, she co-directed the award-winning documentary film Playing the Flute in Shanghai, The Musical Life of Dai Shuhong. Tyler Yamin is a PhD candidate in the Department of Ethnomusicology at the UCLA Herb Alpert School of Music. He is the recipient of the 2020 Best Article Prize from the International Council for Traditional Music. Yamin has researched traditional musical cultures of Indonesia for over a decade, as well as directing, teaching, and tuning numerous gamelan ensembles across Southern California. He is currently completing a dissertation on the role of sound among the gibbons, Southeast Asian apes famous for their complex vocalizations. His work is part of an endangered species conservation project. Before we get going, 2 quick technical bits of housekeeping. Once the screen sharing begins, I encourage you to click view options at the top of your screen and then select side-by-side mode so the video feed doesn't cover any of the presentation. And if you have any questions during this program, please do submit them through the Q&A function found at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can submit and upload questions that you would like to be considered to be answered at the end of the program. All right, that's all from me. Over to you, Helen.
Thanks very much, Bianca. Well, we were really delighted that 4 of our instruments from the World Musical Instrument Collection were selected for inclusion in the Map and the Territory exhibit. And we were invited to work with the Fowler on this talk, on this one very, very special Javanese ivory fiddle. And we selected Tyler Yamin as the perfect speaker for this because he is a real expert in Indonesian music. I'm going to hand over to Tyler now, and I'll be back at the end to moderate the Q&A. So over to you, Tyler.
All right, hello everyone, and welcome to this talk on a Javanese ivory fiddle. Thank you for attending. I'm really excited to be able to share a little bit about this really interesting instrument. The first thing I want to say is that it's titled Javanese ivory fiddle, but in this presentation, I'm going to be referring to it by its Indonesian name, its Javanese name, which is rebab. So it is technically a fiddle. It's a bowed 2-string instrument, but I'm going to be referring to it with the name rebab. This is going to be a very introductory sort of talk, so no prior experience with music or any sort of music, whether Western or Indonesian or anything else, is necessary. So for those of you in the audience who may be experts, some or all of this may be very common knowledge to you, but I still hope you enjoy what I have to say. We have some pretty unusual and interesting audio and visual images to share. So thank you all once again for attending. Over the next few minutes or so, I'm going to be telling 2 stories. One is about the instrument, the Javanese rebab in general. So I'll give a bit of background information about how it's used in performance and a little bit about its physical features. And then I'm also going to be telling the story about this rebab in particular, which, as we'll see, has a very interesting connection to the entire history of world music performance and study in America. But before I get into that, we can't really talk about this instrument without talking about the musical ensemble it is usually a part of, which is the Javanese gamelan. Here's a picture of one. You can see that it is an orchestra, really, an ensemble of many different instruments. All the ones in the picture are percussion instruments. So gamelans are famous for being composed of very, very large gongs, other kinds of xylophones that are called metallophones, smaller gongs like the ones you see in front of you. So the rebab is pretty distinguished in this manner in that it's the only bowed instrument featured in the ensemble. And in fact, it's not just a part of the ensemble, it's not just featured, it's one of the most prestigious instruments that's found in Javanese gamelan. Some of the other ones that aren't bronze, there's the drums you see in this photo. Also, there's a flute and a bamboo flute, and there's some singers, both male and female, but the rebab really has this place of prominence. In fact, one might say that it acts as the leader of the ensemble, even though that's very contested and kind of just one way of characterizing a very complex situation involving an entire orchestra's worth of musicians and instruments. Here's one more photograph of another gamelan that you can kind of see some of the other metallophones, some of the xylophones. And I'll move on to introduce this a little bit more by playing a recording of Javanese gamelan where you'll be able to hear the rebab in the way that it leads the ensemble. So the recording I'm going to play is a very famous recording made by an alumnus of UCLA, Robert E. Brown, in 1971. It's a very famous recording that you may have heard if you've heard recordings of Javanese gamelan before. And what you'll hear when I play this is that the rebab is the instrument that will actually introduce the piece. Here is a photograph of the ensemble that's performing, but from nearly 2 decades before. I'll talk a little bit more about the significance of this photograph and the ensemble in a moment. But just once more, you can see what the gamelan looks like now with some performers. You can see the rebab right up there in the front. And yeah, like I said, you can hear it. You'll hear it in a moment leading the piece. The other thing I could mention is that in this leadership role, another of its jobs is to not introduce the piece, but also the tuning system or mode that the piece that's about to be played is going to be used. Apparently in the traditional court culture in which this music comes from, it was forbidden to speak on stage. So instead of being able to talk or announce the pieces, it was the job of the rebab to kind of play these introductory little phrases that would at least let the musicians know what to expect out of all the many scales and modes available to the musicians. And then in some cases, at least, it would begin the piece. So let's listen to a little bit of that. So once again, you'll hear the rebab as the first instrument, then the rest of the ensemble will join after a few moments. sorry I couldn't play more of that. For those of you who might recognize the piece knows that it's just kind of getting started at that point. But it's really beautiful, and yeah, my apologies for not being able to play more. The reason I picked that piece, not just because it's a beautiful example of Javanese gamelan in general, but one of the things I wanted to reflect on in this talk is how the role of the rebab as this kind of leadership instrument, like we heard it introduce the piece, it's kind of in the vanguard of the gamelan. And this particular recording is particularly important because in 1979, it was chosen to be sent on the Voyager spacecraft as part of the kind of famous golden record that is supposed to include examples of kind of the diversity of human musical expression as it travels throughout space to be received by whatever sort of potential extraterrestrial life is out there. So I just thought it was kind of nicely poetic that the rebab isn't just at the front of the Javanese gamelan, it's actually at the front of kind of human exploration and kind of potential communication with whatever is out there beyond Earth. I just thought it was a nice little connection. But the other thing that you might have noticed in the recording was how quiet the rebab was once the rest of the ensemble entered. And maybe that was a little bit of how the microphones were placed when it was recorded, kind of featuring the vocalists. But once again, that's kind of, it's not a bug, it's a feature of Javanese gamelan. That in fact, as the instruments get more and more complicated, more and more prestigious, they take longer and longer to master. And the rebab does take years, if not a lifetime, to master. They get quieter and quieter and more meditative and more introspective, to the point where, yes, for at least from the audience, it might be difficult to pick out these incredibly complex, masterful notes being produced by a musician at the absolute pinnacle of his ability, or her ability now. So that's an interesting feature of Javanese culture, which is that kind of expertise and kind of refinement going hand in hand. The better you are at something, the less you want to show off. And it is very much reflected in the way the music works. But that's kind of a problem for a talk like this, where I want to really highlight the rebab in itself. So I've chosen some other recordings and images of the instrument by itself, which I will play for you in just a moment. But before that, I just want to mention a little bit about the images and audio recordings I'm going to be using in the rest of this presentation, which come from the collection of this ethnomusicologist named Key Mantle Hood, who founded the ethnomusicology program here at UCLA in the 1950s, and then went on to found other programs in various other universities in America. Behind him, you can see UCLA's very famous Javanese gamelan, Kiai Mindung, or the Venerable Dark Cloud. I'll be talking about that in a few moments again, but important for this talk, Mantle Hood acquired the rebab in question that we're talking about during his research trip to Indonesia in 1957 and 1958. At the same time, he was studying the music himself and doing field work, making recordings of video and audio, among other things, all the different instruments of the gamelan individually. So what I'm about to play and show images of are taken right from his own field recordings and field work, which are held now by the UCLA Ethnomusicology Archive. Here is one of those images. In fact, it's the same rebab player as the previous image I showed of the gamelan in Jakarta, and also the same rebab performer, an incredibly renowned rebab player who is named Pak Chokro, and may very well be familiar to you if you've played Javanese gamelan before or studied it all. But the first little recording I want to play was made by Mantle Hood of Pak Chokro, demonstrating the introduction to a kind of well-known gamelan piece. So here's what the rebab sounds like by itself. Oops. So that's what the rebab sounds like just by itself. But at the same time as making this recording, Mantle Hood also recorded a smaller Javanese ensemble than the complete one we heard in the first track. He just focused on the quietest and most complicated elaborating instruments, which, like the rebab, all play variations on a similar melody. So in the next recording I'm going to play is exactly the same rebab line we just heard, but also with the addition of some of the other complicated instruments that provide that really meditative and elaborate texture that Javanese gamelan is really famous for, in addition to the use of those large gongs, which are not present in this recording. So that was just a little bit of what the rebab sounds like, performing with all these other really amazing, very elaborating instruments. You heard vocals and the flute and a kind of xylophone and metallophone called the gunder. And now I'm going to move on to talk about a little bit about the rebab's kind of geographical history. So here you can see a map of a lot of Africa and Asia. The island of Java I've kind of highlighted in red, so you can see that the right side of the screen. And what I want to talk about here is where the rebab comes from. So what is thought is that the name rebab comes from the musical instruments in the Arabic world. In fact, here you can see a instrument called the rubab from Afghanistan. Another example is a rababa from Egypt. And in fact, the entire Arabic speaking world, all the way from the Middle East into North Africa, and then into kind of South Asia, there's instruments with the name rebab or something similar distributed throughout that entire part of the world. And it was brought to Indonesia through the trade routes that go over the Indian Ocean. So from the coast of Africa, past India and then the Gulf Coast, all the way to Indonesia, brought Islam, and along with it, the name rebab. And while there are a lot of spike fiddles that kind of look similar to the rebab distributed across that part of the world, the form seems more similar to a kind of a set of instruments that are found more in China and Southeast Asia. So here's the erhu. There's also some similar instruments that come from Thailand. So you can kind of see how possibly the name the linguistic part of the instrument came from Arabic, but the form came more for this trade route through going south through Southeast Asia. But I do also want to stress that the Javanese rebab is even though it has this kind of genealogy, this legacy from all these different places, it is its own instrument. It's really, what's so interesting about it is what Javanese culture did with it once it arrived. So next, I will move on to talking a little bit about the parts of the instrument. Put up here a slide where you can see a diagram of all the names in Javanese. I've chosen not to translate them because some of them translate easier than others to English, but just kind of this slide should show you how complex the instrument is and how codified it is and how many different names there are. The one interesting thing I'll say is that a lot of these names are anthropomorphic, that is, they're based on the names of the human body. So at the top, there's a head, shoulders, the parts of the tuning pegs that you can see up here, if you can see my mouse, are called the ears. The skin resonator is called the stomach. There's a foot. Interestingly, what we would call the neck in English is not called a neck. But you can also see here in this diagram the bow. Another interesting thing, which we'll see close up in a moment, is the bridge called the strenten, which is not attached like it would be in a lot of other instruments. It's actually loose, and the skin covering the resonator is very taut. And when the musician goes to play it, they'll actually insert the bridge and put some pressure down on the skin. The skin usually comes from either like a buffalo, either from the bladder or possibly from the stomach lining, which is where the word babat comes from, which means stomach. I'll move on to show some close-ups of some of the pieces of the instrument. So here on the left, you can kind of see a close-up of the incredibly detailed lathe work that goes into the instrument. It's a spike fiddle, which is kind of like a long turned tube or rod or cylinder that goes through the whole length of the instrument. In this case, ivory. And you can just see the detail in that little bit. You can also see a close-up of the bridge and how it kind of rests under the strings and puts pressure on the skin. On the right, on the top, there's a close-up of the little finial on top. And finally, you can see a little bit of the back of the resonator, which is covered with this embroidered ornamental cloth called dodot. The last thing I wanted to mention here is that if you look at the photo that's been up the whole time of the rebab on the left, you'll notice that there's it's billed as an ivory rebab, but there's actually a segment of it that is much darker in the middle of the neck, which could be a dark, like a stained wood or even buffalo horn sometimes. That's actually to distinguish it in the orchestra, in which case usually there's two rebabs used to play the two different main tuning systems of the Javanese gamelan. You can kind of imagine a gamelan like two complete sets of instruments, each able to play a different set of notes. And the rebab is actually one of the ones that you wouldn't technically need two different sets because they're not xylophones with a fixed tuning. You can actually retune them pretty easily because it's a string. But to be complete, the Javanese gamelan should have two, one distinguished with this kind of multicolored ornamentation, and one that would be pure ivory in this case, or it could be wood or even a dark, whether a light wood or a dark wood. If there's two, the one that we see here called pontang would be used to play the scale called slendro, which is just one of the two. The other one's called pelog. But just in case you're wondering, that all of the recordings that I've played so far, everything I've chosen, are the kinds of pieces that would be played by this particular rebab. So with just a moment or two left, I said I was going to talk about the history of this particular rebab, which I will do very quickly. I mentioned that it was brought to America by Mantle Hood, who we see here again, specifically in order to form or to be part of a idea he was very famous for, which is called bimusicality, which was that students of music like Javanese gamelan should not just learn academically, they should actually learn how to perform it, which seems kind of intuitive, but it was a radical idea at the time. But there were really no available instruments or ensembles to perform with. His idea was to bring instruments to America, specifically to UCLA, so his ethnomusicology students would learn to perform them. And like I said, he purchased the gamelan and these rebabs during his research trip in 1957, 1958, some large grants from the Rockefeller Foundation and the Ford Foundation. Here, also in his papers held by the archive, there's some interesting documentation about the rebab. Here's the receipt for when he purchased it. And on the right, there's a letter he wrote about the issues with packing the rebab and sending it from Java to America. In a close-up, right in the middle, you can see that there's a sentence that says he may have several small parcels which should go air freight because they will contain very delicate ivory rebabs, and we must take every precaution to see that they get special handling. Here he's talking about this rebab in particular. And so here's a photograph of him actually teaching on it back at UCLA. Going back to this idea of bimusicality, this was the first, his was the first Javanese gamelan world music ensemble sponsored by a university meant specifically for teaching purposes. But nowadays it's blossomed into there's more than well over 100 gamelans in America alone, let alone all the other different kind of world music ensembles. It's kind of hard to imagine an ethnomusicology department that doesn't have some sort of opportunity for the students to learn and perform the music they're studying. And as this kind of prestigious leading instrument in the Javanese gamelan, this particular rebab actually played an important role in the dissemination of this whole idea, which is now very prevalent across America. So I think that's everything I wanted to cover in this short talk. So thank you for attending. I also really just want to thank the UCLA Ethnomusicology Archive for making these photos and recordings available. Also to the World Music Center at UCLA for also making this rebab exhibit possible, and especially Supina and Z. Adler, the curator of the World Music Instrument Collection, for actually going through all the work of repairing and preparing this exhibit for such an amazing instrument. So thanks once again, and I will stop sharing my screen.
Right, thank you very much, Tyler. So we have a little bit of time for questions. One of the first questions was, what kind of tuning does the rebab have? That's from Nancy.
Okay, thanks, Nancy. The rebab, in terms of the tuning, it has 2 strings, and I haven't really talked about any of the kind of complexities of the tuning system, but the strings are connected to various keys on the gamelan instruments based on what tuning system the piece is in. But there's a lot more kind of freedom in the intonation because it's not fixed, it's not keys. You can put your hands anywhere on the instrument. So there's really a lot of sliding and maybe some kind of inflections that you don't find on the bronze instruments. Very quickly, I hope that answered your question.
Right, thank you. And there's a question from Sherry, which is, how long have these instruments been used in Java?
Well, Javanese gamelan itself is centuries and centuries old. So just in general, it's been developing since at least 500, 600, 700 years, but it's kind of hard to put a date on it because the gamelan kind of has been evolving in a way. There's been something like gamelan in like temple art depicted from 1,000 years ago, but that was a very different kind. This rebab itself was, like I said, purchased in the 1950s, but it was possibly a lot older than that, possibly another 50 or 100 years. I'm not sure if there's any actual documentation of its exact age.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Janet, which is, What are the strings made of? Is the body carved out of, what type of wood is the body carved out of? Presumably, obviously native wood.
Yeah, it's native wood. I'm actually not sure what this one is made out of. In the past, the older versions were made from a coconut shell. And then it got kind of changed to a kind of wood, which I'm not sure. Sometimes if the entire body is made out of wood and not ivory, if it's a light wood, I believe it'll be carved from a kind of tamarind. If it's dark, a kind of rosewood. And I think there was something about the strings. It's interesting, it's actually one string that's kind of wrapped around a little peg on the bottom. I've heard, and I'm not sure if this is true for all rebabs, but definitely for my teacher, that at one point they used the inside of bicycle brakes, I guess the kind of rod that connects the handles to the brakes, and that would be unwound and used as the string. But once again, that's probably not a universal thing.
Okay, we have a comment from Richard, which is that he notices that the Jogja Gender in the photo was still using bamboo tube resonators at that time, similar to the Chirabong Gender now.
Yeah, correct. I believe a lot of kind of the older style gamelan still use bamboo tubes, and that is one of the ones from Yogyakarta where the recording that I played was recorded.
Okay, and I think one last question, that is, a couple of people were asking, how did you learn gamelan? What is your
That's a great question. So I started my undergrad at California Institute of the Arts, which is just a little bit north of UCLA, as a world music major. Just like UCLA does, CalArts offers gamelan classes with world-renowned instructors, definitely because of Mantlehood's legacy. But I just had the opportunity to take a class my first year and completely fell in love with the music and ended up beginning a PhD in order to continue to study Indonesian traditional music.
Okay, thanks very much, Tyler. So I'll hand back to Bianca to wrap up here.
Thank you very much, both of you, and especially Tyler for sharing such fascinating information about this rebab, and to Helen for joining us today to guide us through this program. Really appreciate you sharing your knowledge and your expertise with us today. That was very interesting.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And everyone in the audience, thank you for staying through the presentation, and hopefully you enjoyed it.
Yes, and if you're local, we hope that you'll come to the Fowler soon to check out this beautiful rebab in person for yourself. This program has been recorded, so if you wish to share it, it will be available immediately on our Facebook and on the next couple days on our Instagram and on the Fowler website. And we hope that you guys will join us again for our next program. It'll be next month. Keep your eyes peeled for the program announcement on August 2nd. So in the meantime, have a great Monday, have a great week, have a great rest of the month, and we'll see you again next time. Thank you. Bye, everyone.